Archaeology porn.
Now on this show, we've looked at a lot of ancient stones already at this point, and pretty much the interpretation of them all boil down to one vague function: ritual, and you can take a drink. But that should be your last drink for this episode of Archaeology Porn, because the item we're going to look at today has a much more utilitarian purpose. And indeed, that will make it a first in European history and even world history. We go to Luhan, a commune in Brittany, where in 1900 a very strange stone was recovered. And pardon my pronunciation, I speak French, but that place name, Luhan, is a borrowed word from Breton, which is of course a Celtic language. The finder of this stone was Paul du Châtelier, and I actually couldn't find much about him, but he was a French prehistorian, and he must have been an aristocrat. First, because of that "du" in his name, and second, because he lived in a castle, but more about that later. Anyway, what did he find? Well, he found a kist grave within an early Bronze Age barrow in the Saint Belec section of Luhan. Now, I'm not quite sure what Saint Belec is, because Luhan is a commune, which is sort of the equivalent of a township. So administratively, it doesn't get any smaller than that, so Saint Belec must just be an area within Luhan. Anyway, what's a kist grave? It's not a grave that has been especially loved. It is just a grave that has been lined and packed with stones, creating a sort of stationary coffin in the ground where, of course, the body is placed. Now, I didn't see any information about a body or a cremation, but given that this was found in 1900, at that time a lot of those things were tossed away. They were only interested in the other stuff in the grave. Now, one thing Mr. du Châtelier did find was some pottery that was, pretty typical of the early Bronze Age. And since then, similar specimens of pottery have been dated from about 1900 to 1640 BC, again, the early Bronze Age. But the truly unique thing he found in the grave is that the western edge was lined with a carved stone that measured 3.9 meters in length, 2.1 meters in width, or 12.7 feet by 7 feet. So this was a big stone. The stone was broken and not all of it was recovered, but the carvings made it interesting enough that Monsieur du Châtelier had it carted off back to his humble abode at the Château de Carneuse in Brittany, and he had it sort of repaired by cementing 6 fragments in place. Now, some of those fragments have since been lost, but in 1924, the stone slab, along with du Châtelier's other collections, were donated to the National Museum of Antiquities at the Château of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is a suburb of Paris. And somehow that slab wound up in a niche in the castle's moat. And the stone slab was recovered from that niche in the moat sometime in the 1990s, and then it was placed in the chateau's basement, where it was promptly forgotten about until 2014. Now, I have no idea what prompted these researchers to want to look into such a long-forgotten object, but the slab was subject to some pretty intense research starting in 2017. And as for the findings of that, well, that title sort of gives it away, doesn't it?
Hey, Mike found a map!
But unlike that treasure map the Goonies found in Dr. Walsh's attic, these researchers felt that they had something even better on their hands. You see, this was not just any map. That early Bronze Age dating would make this the oldest map of a specifically known place ever found in Europe and probably even the world. And the area the map depicted was the area right around the grave. And of course, being carved in stone, this was a 3D map, allowing the researchers to use a range of techniques in analyzing it.
But sir, your 3D glasses.
Well, actually, a lot higher tech than that, but in some ways also lower tech. Let me explain. On the high-tech side, the team used a technique we've discussed before, photogrammetry, essentially taking a lot of super close-up photos and creating a sort of digital model. And with this model, the researchers could do a lot of cool stuff. First, the researchers created an elevation model, similar to what any archaeologist would do in a real site. You'd be familiar with this if you remember our discussion of that lost civilization that was discovered under the forests of Ecuador. In that example, the researchers created a 3D map of that whole area. And with this elevation map combined with the super detailed photos, the researchers could look at the minute details of the chipping and the carving to find out some of how it was made and how it weathered. And a fancy term for that is called morphology. And based on the morphology, which showed that the chippings were pretty fresh, not very weathered, and the stone surface was only slightly discolored, the researchers were able to determine that at the time this thing went in the ground, it was pretty fresh. It hadn't been exposed to the elements for very long. Moreover, the research team was even able to determine the order in which most of the features were carved, identifying 9 specific phases. Now, they did this by looking at the minuscule details of the carving, especially where they intersected one another, so they were able to figure out the sequence of how those carvings were made. And in this way, they were able to produce a sort of stratigraphy, and they mapped this out using something called a Harris matrix, which we will discuss in a later episode. So that was the high-tech stuff. Now let's discuss the low-tech, old-fashioned archaeology stuff. They compared the Saint Belec Slab to other known or believed to be ancient maps from Asia, Africa, and Europe. And they specifically compared the features that are considered as rivers or field systems or boundaries or even man-made features. However, this didn't quite do the trick, as none of these comparisons are absolutely proven to be maps, and in some cases it's quite contentious, because there is a definite strain of thought out there that says a pre-literate society would have lacked the ability to depict a bird's-eye view of a widespread area with the sense of perspective and scale that would have been needed to do that. Therefore, the authors then turned to ethnoarchaeology, comparing the depictions on the Saint Belec Slab with those on other current or more recent and therefore better documented societies. And if you want to know more about ethnoarchaeology and take a deep dive into that, feel free to see our ABCs of Archaeology episode focusing specifically on that topic. And for this, the authors selected some small-scale traditional societies in Mali and Africa and in Papua New Guinea, showing that these societies had no trouble producing maps showing areas ranging from 10 kilometers to the sizable portion of the Sahara Desert using stylized lines and geometric shapes similar to what you'd find on the Saint Belec Slab. And incidentally, the map supposedly depicted on the Saint Belec Slab fits very nicely into that range, showing an area of approximately 30 by 21 kilometers or 19 by 13 miles. And on the slab, the researchers could pretty clearly identify geographic features like hills and rivers that are still apparent in the landscape today, as well as human settlements and other features like barrows that are actually known archaeological sites. Now, some of the things would have changed, like the course of rivers, but they found up to an 80% accuracy in this map. So at this point, I'm pretty convinced that yes, this is a map. But why would this map have been made in the first place, and why would it have been placed in this grave? Well, if you recall from our site visit to the alignments of Karnak, this area, Brittany, has a very long history of creating megalithic stones. Those alignments of Karnak are more than 2,000 years older than the Saint Belec Slab, in fact. But whoever made the Saint Belec slab probably would have been aware of those alignments of Karnak, as well as the other megalithic monuments in the area, because quite frankly, they're pretty difficult to miss. And the dude whose grave the Saint Belec slab was incorporated into was very likely someone of some importance given how special his grave was. And in general, the early Bronze Age is considered to be the very beginnings of state formation, little chiefdoms and fiefdoms which you could usually walk across in a day or two. So the idea here was that the Saint Belec slab is a map depicting the territory of a certain chieftain or powerful leader, and that would be the person buried in the grave. And while such a map may have been useful for an early system of land tenure or even planning around agriculture, the fact that it's immovable limits its usefulness. I like to think of it like this. We know this is a society where they were familiar with these megalithic stones. So perhaps this stone with the guy's domain carved into it was merely just a symbol of his power and influence to any that would be in the area. And of course, this is something we've seen in ancient Egypt, later in Rome, even in Britain and Ireland with those Ogham stones, in which people laid down a megalithic stone simply to say, hey, this is my territory, I rule here, sometimes bragging about accomplishments, or sometimes, like in those Ogham stones, just simply listing the person's name. But why would the stone have been broken and placed in his grave? Well, some claim that this is a clear sign of disrespect. The dude was dead, his rule was broken, good riddance. However, I'm not so sure of that. Remember what we saw at Flag Fen. By this point, Europe had already a long tradition of people sort of breaking stuff and ritualistically depositing it as a sort of commemoration for the dead or offering, and oops, there's the R word. So I guess I lied. One more drink for this episode. Or who knows, across many places and time periods, people were buried with things that were believed to be useful in their death. So perhaps the stone was buried with this person to sort of signify that they were the eternal leader of the area even in their death. Kind of like Kim Il-sung of North Korea, who died in the 1990s but is still the country's eternal leader. In any event, those are some pretty good guesses backed by comparisons and a lot of scientific evidence. But we'll never be 100% sure why the Saint Belec slab was carved into a map and why that was deposited in this kissed grave. Now, if you want to see the Saint Belec slab in person, I've got some bad news for you. You can definitely visit the Chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is quite accessible from central Paris. It's a beautiful and important historic site in its own right. It does have that museum, and you could spend days walking around the garden and the enormous grounds. And when I asked the staff at the museum where the slab was, they had no idea what I was talking about. So that means either the slab is not open for the general public to see, so you'd have to request special permission in advance to view it, or simply that section of the museum has been closed for so long that the non-specialist staff there simply don't know what it is. Either way, it doesn't look like you're going to be able to get in to see the Saint Belec slab in the flesh anytime soon, so you're just going to have to rely on the internet to shows like this one if you want to have a look at this specimen of hot archaeology porn. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.